Welcome to the Living the International Life podcast, where we discuss all topics from studying, working, and living abroad, and even language learning. And I'm your host, Jazz Cole, president and founder of Multilingual and Philanthropic Incorporated. Let's dive right in. Welcome to another episode of Living the International Life podcast. And this episode, we have a special guest, Kristin Montgomery from Growing Global Citizens. And we're basically going to have a conversation with a traveling teacher who has basically taught in 5 countries as well as lived in 6. So thanks so much, Kristin, for being here and sharing your knowledge and your experience.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So I know I initially found you because you gave a really great presentation at the World Language Teachers Summit, which I actually presented last year as well. But I remember yours was very interesting because you were talking about all the opportunities you can get as a traveling while also teaching. And I kind of wanted to know like where your background was and how you kind of made your way up until where you are now.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I don't really have a traditional teacher background to start. You know, a lot of people say they know they want to be teachers right away, and they go to teachers college and graduate with a degree and start right away. I kind of was fighting whether or not I wanted to be a teacher for a long time. I did a lot of things that were teaching related, like teaching Sunday school or teaching swim lessons, being a camp counselor. But when I was in college, I didn't get a teaching major. But then after I graduated, I went and I did the English assistant program in Spain. So this is a great program that's an opportunity for people of lots of different ages. You don't have to just be like a college graduate or a person just out of college. And they put you in elementary school or a high school in Spain. And yeah, it's a great chance to work on your Spanish, and you're an assistant in that school. So I did that right after I graduated. And during that time, I realized, okay, I do really want to be a teacher. I knew that I had loved languages and really loved traveling and other cultures. And so I came back and pretty soon after that decided to get my teaching license. And as I was getting my teaching license, I basically knew that I wanted to teach abroad. So I had, I guess, through some connections and just kind of researching on the internet, found out that there were international schools all over the world that would hire certified teachers to work. And I ended up getting my first job kind of as an internship, and I did my student teaching there. And it was a boarding school in Switzerland. And then I was fortunate enough to just be able to stay there. And I was hired on basically full time the following year. So that's how I got started. And I've been to a number of different places since then, back and forth. Spent some time in the States, and most recently was in Colombia.
Okay. I'm interested to know what it was like being in Switzerland, because that's actually a country that's on my bucket list in terms of, because I want to do a master's abroad. And I know that between France, Belgium, and Switzerland are on my top tier of countries. So I'm wondering what that's like, especially like the fact that it is a multilingual country.
Absolutely. So there are lots of international schools in Switzerland, and Switzerland is definitely very multilingual, like you said. The western part speaks French. The majority of the country speaks German, and then a little bit in the southern part speaks Italian. And then there's just a very small smattering of another language called Romansh. And most people speak 2, 3, 4 languages in Switzerland. And then, of course, there are lots of people that are not Swiss, but that are from other countries that live there. I love living in Switzerland. It's really, really clean. The people have a reputation of being maybe not the most friendly, but not in any means rude or unkind. And things seem to work very well. It's very modern. very internationally, globally minded in most of the parts, in the big cities at least. The mountainous areas and rural areas are a little bit more conservative, definitely. But yeah, I really love living there.
Okay, because I noticed from your website you said that you taught French, Spanish, ESL, and social studies, and I'm interested to see what kind of credentials or training you had to go through, and what does that necessarily look like? I don't know. I feel like most of the time, for me, my languages are mainly obtained by self-teaching, just because I actually just learned French in high school, and well, actually no, before that, and then I took it all the way up until high school, but then after that, I just kind of kept learning because I had friends and things like that. So, what kinds of credentials do you usually go through just to teach those specific languages, and what does that necessarily look like?
Yeah, so I was certified as a teacher in Minnesota at the time to teach French and Spanish. Um, Depending on where you're teaching, you may need to show a certification of your language skills. And they're usually going to ask you to speak in that language during the interview to kind of test your language level. But in general, you just need to be a certified teacher. So to have the credentials in a state in the US or another country, generally English speaking countries like Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Great Britain, to be able to teach. So the fact that I actually started out teaching 2 sections of French 1, and obviously I'm a non-native French speaker, so teaching French in French-speaking Switzerland is quite odd. That doesn't usually happen, as you can probably imagine. But because it was a boarding school and because they just needed someone to fill these 2 sections, and it was kind of like an internship, they hired me on for that. But obviously, with international teaching, oftentimes they do prefer native speakers of that language. And also for visa purposes, sometimes they can only hire native speakers of a language, or they can only hire, for example, people that are from the European Union or that have certain passports. So those things do come into play also.
Okay. And so in going through that, is it more like, what are kind of things that you see that come up in terms of like teaching the language itself? In that case, do you feel like there's a curriculum that's given to you, or that there's a curriculum that's given to you, or do you have to come up with your own curriculum?
Depends on the school. I guess just like the US, I mean, ideally there should be a curriculum, but sometimes you end up getting into a school where there isn't. For example, I actually, at the school in Switzerland, I ended up expanding the Spanish program. So then as I expanded it, there wasn't a curriculum, so I had to create it on my own, which I actually really enjoy doing. So for me, that's not a negative, but it is a lot more work, certainly. But often international schools will follow the International Baccalaureate curriculum, or
Okay.
they'll offer AP classes, but AP has a pretty strict syllabus. The IB doesn't really, or you're going to have a curriculum that's within that framework. It's really a framework. It's not going to tell you what to do on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. So it really depends on the school. Usually there should be a curriculum, but like I said, there are some instances where sometimes there isn't.
Okay. Yeah. So, because even for me as a private teacher, since I teach mainly individually instead of with a group, I feel like most of the time I can make it more personalized because it's one person and it's tailored to their needs versus having to tailor to a whole class who may have completely different learning styles. I don't know. I feel like, do you ever have like when you create curriculums, does that ever have is that ever something that comes into mind when you have to create your own curriculum? And usually, how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, it is. And I will say the one thing, when you're teaching students in an international school, you're generally going to be teaching students that are, one, often non-native speakers of English, and two, often already multilingual. So that poses different challenges, I guess. You know, often when we're thinking about teaching in a high school, in the United States, like if you're teaching Spanish 1 or German 1 or whatever it is, you're getting a group of students that probably has never taken that language before. And they probably, I mean, it totally depends on where you are in the United States, of course, but they probably don't speak other languages. So in an international school, you're coming in and you might have a student from France, a student from Korea, a student from India, a student from China, a student from Brazil. And so obviously, you know, if I'm teaching a Spanish speaker French or a Portuguese speaker French, they're going to learn at a different pace than someone that is from China who, you know, is learning English as their second language and learning French as their third language. So that does pose sometimes there are challenges and sometimes it makes it easier depending on the language and where that student is from. For example, like when I had Japanese students and I was teaching Spanish, the vowel sounds in Spanish and Japanese are the same. And so my Japanese students actually had really good Spanish pronunciation. So depending on which language students already speak, that could make a difference, but you do have to take that into account as a teacher.
Okay. And then so upon obtaining like your first international job, I want to know like what your thought process is, because I know that sometimes I remember even when I was teaching my first group of students, particularly with French, is that I'm like, okay, well, I'm a non-native speaker. Like, am I going to teach them the right thing? You know, what kind of goes through your mind from the very beginning of when you started teaching?
Yeah. I guess, like I said, knowing that they're from different places and have very different life experiences, I think that does make me think about it in a different way. It was nerve-wracking, I will admit, to be teaching French in a French-speaking country. I definitely had some imposter syndrome there. And I remember one time I actually had a student that was Russian in my French 1 class, and I had a conference with his father, and his father was from Russia, but he spoke perfect French. And I felt very, very inadequate. And so, yeah, there certainly is some of that. I think you just have to kind of show students that you're learning too. You know, we're lifelong learners, even as teachers, and that's a really important attitude to have, and just do the best that we can, even when we may be lacking some confidence in certain situations.
That makes sense. I mean, and then even in that, I'm kind of interested in like your day-to-day routine, because of course, like with teaching and then having to be in a new environment, and then also the fact that I know that school systems are not the same as they are in the United States, especially because I know like in like other countries, they kind of have like they don't necessarily have like the same structures we would have like for high school, for instance. So like, what does your day-to-day routine usually look like when you're dealing with your students?
Yeah, so it really depended on which country I was in. In Spain, I was teaching in very much a Spanish elementary school. So my day there was 9:30 to 2:30. And we actually ate lunch at, or 2 o'clock. We ate lunch at 2 o'clock, which is very, very late, but that's how it is in Spain. So, you know, I would teach my classes and then go home, and I would be done and back home by 3 o'clock, which was quite nice. In Colombia, I had to get up incredibly early because we had a really, really long school day. And so I got picked up by the teacher bus essentially at 5:50 in the morning. So it was very, very early. Yeah, we got to school before 7 o'clock, and school started at 7 o'clock, and it went until 3:30. So it was an incredibly long day. Other places, it's been more, usually I take public transportation in those other countries. So like in Singapore and in Switzerland, I was in international schools that were not run by the country. And so in those cases, my schedule was very much like a teaching day in the US from about, 8 to 4 with maybe an hour lunch, 45-minute lunch. the teaching loads that I had were similar to in the US public schools or less than US public schools. So, for example, I'm going to be teaching in Germany in August, and my contract actually says 37.5 teaching hours a week. So it's actually less than a 40-hour work week. And I think that's typical in Germany, but certainly not typical in the United States.
Yeah. And I also feel like in that aspect as well, like there's usually culture shocks, like, oh my gosh, having to get up that early. Outside of that, because I know like as a teacher, you probably, you're not just teaching all day. I mean, of course you have a life. So like what kind of culture shocks have you kind of experienced in, I don't know, just in general, like having to just in the general aspect of being in a new environment?
Yeah. I know for Europe and also for Singapore, it was very much personal space was a culture shock. Singapore is a small island that's quite densely populated, and obviously space in Europe, is quite different than in the United States. Cars are much smaller, hotel rooms, houses are much smaller. So I think that's something that kind of still gets to me. The way people talk and communicate with each other, you kind of have to learn those patterns. For example, in Colombia, it was very, very important to always come in and say hello and say, how are you doing? Before you would ask for anything, even if you just like need to borrow a pencil or something, it was like, you need to come in and like create that community with people, right? Have that relationship. That was super, super important. So it took a while to learn those things. And even if you're fluent in the language or speak the language, there are still lots of things that you don't really know and you have to learn. For example, in Singapore, one of the cultural things is they have these food courts outside that are very, very popular, and they have very good food. And people put down Kleenex packs to reserve a table. And I think one time I went and I didn't know that was what you do at these hawker centers. And I threw away the Kleenex that was on the table and took someone's table. So just little things like that, that, it'll get you in trouble, but you learn it very quickly. And I think one thing that's really great about international teaching is as you're learning about other cultures, it also reveals a lot about your own culture. So, it makes me realize how Americans have some not great traits, like we're very wasteful with a lot of things. We use a lot of energy. We're generally very loud. There's a lot of great things about us also, but these are things that you see as you kind of see your own culture in a different light.
I agree with that because I remember when I did a study abroad program when I was in college, and it was in Paris, and I remember finding out that there's like a certain way you order coffee at like a cafe, and I remember I ordered and then I sat down, and then this one guy who's sitting at the table across from me says in English, he doesn't serve. You have to get up and wait for him. And I was like, I didn't know that. I was just like, okay, because my thought process was, okay, I sit down, like, kind of like how at Starbucks, you sit down and then they'll call your name or they'll say like, ma'am, your whatever is ready. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that you have to stay there before you go to a table. So I was like, okay, well, and then after that, I was kind of like scared to buy another coffee later on. But I remember that being one thing.
Yeah, definitely. There's lots of instances like things like that.
I mean, and I also, because one of the things I also remember was trying to build community, because when I was studying abroad, I was the only student that spoke fluent French. So I remember my experience being completely different. I mean, obviously, like as you were saying earlier, you could think that you know the language, but there's a lot you don't know. And so I remember going to this church that happened to be around the corner because we had a free weekend. And I remember all these people being like, oh my gosh, there's this American who speaks French. And I'm like, I was not trying to get this much attention. And I realized that they're not used to someone being from America who can speak their language to a point where it's beyond like, can you tell me where the bathroom is? Or like, I would like to order this. And it's like, being able to express yourself, which is something that I really emphasize with my students about building a sentence and kind of building off of that, making it more complex and, learning all these different forms of conjugation. But I'm kind of interested to know how you kind of connect with like your students and even build a community. So it's not like I'm here, I go to work and I go home and, I don't really do anything outside of that because I'm afraid to talk to people, or I'm afraid to kind of, I don't know, have a life.
Yeah. I will say in international schools, there tends to be a little bit more community just because everyone is from somewhere else often. And you're often only there for a few years. So you kind of look at the school as your way to connect with each other. Whereas I think, when I got a job in the United States, it really wasn't that. Like there weren't that many after work activities or anything like that. Whereas often staff in international schools will travel with each other because you're all free for longer periods and you want to go explore the surrounding area, or they're really more your social group than maybe in the United States. And connecting with students, I think, is actually very similar to the way that I would connect with students in the US, trying to get to know them, get to know their interests, and then trying to find something that you have in common. Like if they play a certain sport or do an extracurricular activity that you like or that you want to learn more about. And I also think that if you show interest in their cultures, their home cultures, then they really like that also. Like I spoke a little bit of Portuguese, not very well, but enough that I would have conversations with my students. And I think the Brazilian students that I've had find that really cool, and they really, really warmed up to me then. Because it's certainly not common that they would find someone that would be able to speak Portuguese.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. Because I know I had someone that I knew who she's from the US, but she actually decided to move to Portugal. And I remember her talking about how she was trying to learn Portuguese, but it was like when you use Google Translate, they're like, that's Brazilian Portuguese, it's not European, and kind of having to kind of navigate the differences. And she says that like most of the time, I think people are, if you're trying, it's a lot easier to communicate with people versus just like, it's too difficult, I'm just going to we'll just speak English more than anything else.
Yeah, the effort is appreciated, definitely.
Yeah. And so, I mean, outside of like language barriers, what other challenges did you feel like you've encountered in like, your experience abroad?
Missing family and friends is definitely one. I think that is a hard one because there's kind of no way to fix it or to prepare yourself, especially important events. I've actually always gone home in the summer, and I've gone home at Christmas time also. But there are still tons of events, birthdays, Thanksgiving, Mother's Day. I found that Thanksgiving is the time that I get the most homesick, just because, I'm not with my family and there's no Thanksgiving dinner usually anywhere in Europe. But it's also a time where sometimes I've made my own Thanksgiving dinner with friends. And so that can be a good bonding opportunity.
Okay.
Yeah. Did you do any of that when you were abroad? Celebrate holidays?
Somewhat. I know that when we were there, it was we were there through 4th of July. And even though like we didn't have 4th of July, it wasn't a national holiday there. But I remember we actually had this trip where we went to Versailles for the whole day. And we did the whole museum tour, but we just spent the whole day in like the garden. And so there was so many things to do. I think we like were on, there's like this big lake, and we were basically attempting to row the boat down the river, or down the lake. And so I remember us trying not to go around in a circle, because I remember I've never rowed a boat before, but I remember having to teach my friends because I've seen it only on TV. And so we finally managed to do that. But I remember having like the greatest time. I know in like Germany, because I was an au pair in the last couple of years, and even though we didn't have Halloween, because I usually love like horror movies, like Halloween themed movies, but they did have St. Martin's Day, which is like on November the 7th, which is like about a week after. But still, it was like we had these little lanterns, and you would walk up like with a bunch of children, you would walk through the streets and you would sing these little songs, and then you would go to like a church, and typically it's like they do have a form of trick-or-treating too. And I remember going to this one house, and it was like an older couple, and they're like, okay, so like candy for the children, and they're like, for the adults that are here, because it was like me and like my host mother, and then like the other kids' parents, and they gave us all shots of schnapps, and I was like, we do that? Just it's like, all right, cool. So it's like, all right, now see you later.
A different type of celebrating.
Yeah. So it's kind of like interesting. And then even though we didn't have Thanksgiving, it was, I think we had St. Nicholas Day, which is like, I think December 6th. And it's like you leave your shoes out and you put like the little stuff in it overnight.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's like there's other holidays that kind of make up for it.
Yeah, you get to learn about that culture's holidays.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool. Yeah, I think one of the other things too that's a challenge is the fact that when you're teaching in international schools, the community is often very transient. And so people are coming and going all the time. So, maybe you come and you make a really good friend, or you get really close to certain students. And then at the end of the year, they might be leaving and they're gone. And that gets very difficult, I think, to, I guess, emotionally, obviously, and, just socially, because obviously it's great that everyone can make new friends, but it's also really difficult to know that friends are leaving and you're already without your family and friends from home.
Yeah, I felt that too, because I think when I was coming back from Paris, it was like, I made all these friends and we all had these great times. And then it's like, well, I have to go. And I haven't seen them in about, I want to say over 5 years since I last was there. And since then, I think, because I still keep in contact, because I think we still all have our WhatsApp numbers. And I remember one of them got married and has had a child since then. So I'm like, everyone's kind of moving on with their life. And I'm like, I still want to make sure that I'm like keeping up to date.
Yeah. And that's the positive thing too. I mean, it's like you do make these friends from all around the world. So now, for example, when I go to Germany now, the roommate that I had in Singapore is German. So I'm going to be able to see her, and I'm going to be able to see somebody else that I worked with when I was in Switzerland. And so you may see these people again. I know that it's really hard when you're leaving and not knowing, but I think once you've been around and taught internationally, you often end up coming back and you have connections all around the world.
Yeah. Kind of makes you feel like you're a real global citizen.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Oh. Speaking of that, I actually wanted to know a little bit more about growing global citizens, because I know that is something that you have started, and I looked at your website and I know you have a lot of really, really helpful information regarding like travel and teaching and whatnot. And so I kind of wanted to know like where you got this idea from.
Sure. Well, I actually got it started, I think it was like 2018, 2019, when I had come back to the States and I was teaching Spanish language arts in high school as part of a continuation of a dual language immersion program. So it was for kids that had been taking Spanish since kindergarten, and half of them spoke Spanish at home. And I kind of got thrown into this job, and the curriculum that was there was not appropriate for the level that the kids had at all. And so I had to completely revamp it. And I was the only teacher at the school teaching those classes, only teacher in the district at the time also, because we were the first school to have this program. And so I just felt like I was very alone and didn't have anyone to collaborate with. But then I started, after a couple of years, getting my footing and kind of feeling like I was making progress and learning a lot through making lots of mistakes. But I also did something, I don't know if you've heard of the National Writing Project.
I have not.
Okay, so it's this organization, and they teach writing, and you wouldn't think, okay, language teachers, we don't focus that much on teaching writing, like journaling or different types of writing. But I did this month-long workshop basically during the summer. And one of the big things that National Writing Project pushes is that we are all learners and we are all teachers, and that sometimes, you know, the best professional development comes from other teachers, which I think is 100% true. And also, it was really teaching us that we are all writers. And if we want our students to feel like they are writers, we have to write. And that was something that I had never really felt like I was a writer, or I was a very strong writer at least. So anyway, that kind of spurred me to start putting up things on a blog for what I was doing in the classroom. And it just kind of morphed into Growing Global Citizens. And what I do there now is I help teachers to kind of bring the world to their classroom and bring their classroom to the world. So that could be through world language teaching, it could be through international teaching, or it could be through general travel and some student field trips and student travel.
Okay. So usually, like, even, you know, overall, like with encouraging teachers as well as students, how do you feel like is one of the best ways to encourage students to, outside of just learning the language, but also go abroad with it, or, like, you know, to do something with it, versus, like, you know, where you have I have a lot of private students where they'll say, yeah, you know, I took French in high school, I don't remember any of it, and I never found any use for it.
Yeah, that's everyone's favorite phrase to hear as a teacher, right? Yeah, I think as teachers, as much as we can, to really make the language real for our students in the classroom. So using it to communicate more than teaching like a grammar-based curriculum, obviously. Looking at culture, looking at what is going on in those countries that speak the language, and getting students interested in things that can help them be lifelong learners also. So maybe that's, you know, interest in Spanish salsa music or dance or certain Netflix series in the language. And then I think trying to normalize going abroad, because it's still a pretty small, very small, I think. I don't remember what it was exactly, but I think it's something like, I don't know, maybe 8% of students, at least for sure in high school, that go abroad. And so I think doing what we can to either offer trips at schools or to offer more information about organizations that do trips for students, and also telling them, you know, okay, well, if you can't go in high school, maybe you don't feel comfortable with it, could you go at university? And maybe if money is an issue, because obviously it costs a lot of money to go abroad, could you go after you graduated and do a job like the one that I did in Spain? There's similar programs in France and in Austria, or other places where you can go and teach English. So how can we make adjustments and modifications so that going abroad could be something that everyone could strive to do?
That makes sense. Yeah, and especially because also you said that your next job is in Germany. So, like, what are your expectations with this opportunity? Yeah, because especially because I lived there as an au pair, and I enjoyed my experience there. So it'd be interesting to know what you're expecting it to kind of pan out to be as a teacher versus taking care of children.
Yeah, definitely. Which city were you in?
With my first family, I was in Celle, which I actually had to look up where that was, because apparently it's a really small town about an hour away from Hanover. And then with my second family, I was in Duisburg, which is about 5 minutes away driving from Dusseldorf.
Okay. So more, Hanover at least is more north, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be in Stuttgart. which is more southwest, kind of close to France and Switzerland, that corner. Um, and yeah, I'm really excited. I'm going to be teaching just Spanish, mostly middle school, a little bit of high school. So that'll be a bit of a change for me. And I'm excited. I'm working on Duolingo German right now because I took a German class, I think one semester in college, but I don't remember much other than, a few things to get around and order food and stuff. So it'll be a bit of a new challenge. But I'm really looking forward to teaching the International Baccalaureate Middle Years Program curriculum because I haven't got experience in that. So that'll be a very good opportunity. And then I'm excited to be able to have enough other Spanish teachers that we have a team to collaborate with, because that's something that I haven't had often. I've often been the only teacher of that subject, which can be kind of lonely and kind of hard. So I'm excited to have some collaborators.
Oh, that sounds really awesome. Yeah. I mean, because I feel like particularly when I think about teaching, because most of the time I'm usually teaching what my native speaker friends usually tell me, because I spend so much time, because like I feel like at the same time as a teacher we're still learning. And so like I remember when I got a VPN for the first time a few years back, I was trying to find like little streaming networks where I could just watch TV, and I literally was, even though I didn't fully understand every single thing, I was still picking out like things like, oh, that's an interesting phrase, I've never heard that before, but based on the context, I think they're trying to say this, and usually I'll teach it in the same context, because I feel like more than anything, it's like, especially like native speaker friends, that's usually where I practice with, and I just bring it to beginners. No. Yeah. I mean, do you usually have like a specialty? Because I know for me, I'm usually beginners more than anything else. I know that some people are really good at like teaching little kids. Some people really like adults. So like, do you feel like you have like a specialty that you kind of fall into?
I've usually done more like 9th, 10th graders, but I've really done just about everything through private lessons. If you consider private lessons too, then I've done from 4 years old to adults, but mostly within a school setting, it has been high school. I did 1 year of 5th grade also, and that was a bit of a shock when I moved back to the US. But I'm looking forward, like I said, to trying middle school. It's going to be a little more of a challenge. Got to really make sure I've got my classroom management down.
Yeah. I mean, just kind of like a final thing, just in wrapping up, is I want to know like what you would advise someone who's more or less looking into international opportunities, whether it be teaching or anything else, and they're kind of like putting it on the back burner or getting overwhelmed with the process of like the application or the visa processes. Because I know that even though it's exciting to do, but there's still a lot of things on the back end you still need to do. So I'm wondering what you'd advise anyone in that kind of situation where they just are kind of overwhelmed or just like putting it off.
Yeah, that's a good question. It can definitely be overwhelming because there are lots of things that you need to prepare for. It's not just like getting the paperwork, it's also cleaning up everything and taking care of all your stuff at home to be able to leave for a year or longer. So I would say make lots of lists. Those are your best friends. Figure out what needs to be done when and try to get it done by those deadlines. Try to figure out like what things do you really need to bring with you? What things can you buy there? So if you have contacts at your school, that's a great thing to ask. If you have, I don't know, a special type of like shampoo or toothpaste or that kind of thing that sounds like something minor but can make a big difference to your happiness if you're really attached to it. Feel free to ask and figure out what you can buy in the country. Patience and flexibility is vital because paperwork takes a long time and things are not going to go the way that you expect. And sometimes they turn out better, sometimes they turn out worse. But just being flexible and knowing that this is all part of the journey and the adventure and trying to keep a positive attitude and you will have a great time and you will learn from it no matter what.
Yeah. That's good advice, because I usually tell my students, and because especially the ones that are interested in abroad, I always tell them, like, try to make sure you plan at least a year or a year and a half in advance, just to kind of get everything together. But anyway, thank you so much, Kristin, for your time and sharing your knowledge and your experience and just overall just chatting with me. And for all our listeners who want to find more about Kristin and growing global citizens, her website is growingglobalcitizens.com, and she is Growing Global Citizens on Instagram.
Thanks, Jess.
All right.